Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Mitchell had served in the Royal Guards for 15 years, earning his position through unwavering dedication and a spotless service record. At 42, he commanded respect from both his subordinates and superiors. Known throughout the regiment for his integrity and commitment to protecting the British Crown, his life had been built on clear principles, duty, honor, and absolute loyalty to the monarchy he had sworn to defend. On a crisp October morning in 2023, Andrew arrived at Wellington Barracks for what he expected to be a routine day of administrative duties and training supervision. The autumn. Leaves were turning golden in St. James's Park. Tourists were already gathering near Buckingham Palace for the changing of the guard ceremony later that morning. Andrew took pride in these ceremonies, seeing them as visible symbols of the traditions and values his regiment represented. His assistant, Captain Sarah Reynolds, greeted him with the morning briefings and a stack of correspondence that required his attention. Among the usual reports and administrative documents was a sealed envelope marked personal and confidential. With his name written in elegant script across the front, the envelope bore no return address or official stamps, immediately catching Andrew's attention as unusual. "Did you see who delivered this?" Andrew asked Sarah, holding up the mysterious envelope. "It was here when I arrived this morning, sir," Sarah replied. "Security didn't mention any special deliveries, so it must have come through normal channels." Andrew examined the envelope more carefully. The paper was expensive, the kind used for formal invitations or important correspondence. The handwriting was clearly that of someone educated and accustomed to formal communication. Despite his curiosity, Andrew set the envelope aside to deal with first. Focusing on the urgent matters that required his immediate attention, the morning progressed normally until Andrew received an unexpected phone call from the Cabinet Office. The caller identified himself as Robert Thornton, a senior civil servant Andrew had never heard of before. Thornton's voice was cultured and authoritative, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I need to speak with you about a matter of national importance," Thornton said without preamble. "I understand you're a man who can be trusted with sensitive information and difficult decisions." Andrew felt immediately cautious. In his experience, conversations that began with flattery about trustworthiness often led to requests that tested the very qualities being praised. "I'm always willing to serve my country, sir, but I'd need to understand more about what's being asked of me." Thornton chuckled softly. "Quite right to be cautious, Colonel. What I'm about to discuss requires absolute discretion. There are political developments that could affect the stability of the government and, by extension, the monarchy itself. People in positions of responsibility sometimes need to make difficult choices to protect the greater good." The conversation was dancing around something specific, but Thornton wasn't yet willing to be direct about what he wanted. Andrew found this approach unsettling, as military communications typically valued clarity and straightforward language over political maneuvering. "I'd be happy to help in any way appropriate to my position," Andrew replied carefully, "but I'd need specifics about what kind of assistance you're seeking." Thornton's tone became more serious. "Colonel, I'm going to suggest you open the envelope you received this morning. It contains information that will help you understand the situation we're facing. After you've reviewed it, we should meet in person to discuss how you might contribute to resolving a delicate problem." The call ended abruptly, leaving Andrew staring at his phone and then at the unopened envelope on his desk. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Somehow Thornton had known about the envelope's delivery and contents. Andrew realized he was being drawn into something far more complex than routine military duties. With growing apprehension, Andrew opened the envelope and found a single sheet of high-quality paper containing what appeared to be a detailed intelligence report. The document described a planned protest outside Parliament the following week. Organized by a group opposing recent government policies on military spending and international involvement, the report contains specific details about the protesters' plans, their leaders, their intended tactics. What made the document disturbing was not the protest information itself, but the handwritten notes in the margins suggesting ways the protest could be managed to serve larger political purposes. The notes referenced creating necessary incidents that could justify stronger government responses to civil dissent and potentially lead to expanded security powers. At the bottom of the document was a handwritten, Colonel Mitchell. Your regiment's ceremonial duties put you in unique positions during public events. Sometimes the protection of democracy requires actions that seem contrary to democratic principles. We need someone of your integrity to ensure that necessary. Steps are taken to preserve stability. Andrew read the document 3 times, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with its implications. The message seemed to be suggesting that he use his position within the Royal Guards to facilitate some kind of incident during the planned protest, possibly to justify a government crackdown on civil liberties. The reference to necessary incidents was particularly troubling, suggesting manufactured events designed to manipulate public opinion. The moral implications were staggering. Andrew had devoted his career to protecting democratic institutions and the rule of law. The idea of participating in a scheme to undermine those very principles, even under the guise of protecting them, violated everything he believed in. Yet, the document had come from someone with apparent connections to the highest levels of government, making refusal potentially problematic. For his career and regiment, Andrew locked the document in his secure desk drawer and spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on routine duties while his mind wrestled with the ethical dilemma he was facing. The protesters mentioned in the document were British citizens exercising their democratic rights. Using his position to facilitate violence against them would be a betrayal of his oath to serve the crown and protect the people. As the day progressed, Andrew found himself analyzing every aspect of the situation. Who was Robert Thornton really, and what authority did he have to make such requests? Was this some kind of test of Andrew's loyalty, or was it a genuine request to participate in political manipulation? The lack of official channels or written authorization made the entire situation feel illegitimate and dangerous. That evening, as Andrew drove home through the London traffic, he realized that his comfortable world of clear moral guidelines and straightforward duties had been shattered by a single envelope and phone call. The choice he made in response to this approach would define not only his own character, but potentially affect the lives of innocent citizens and the integrity of the institutions he had sworn to protect. Andrew spent a restless night analyzing the document and phone call from every possible angle. By morning, he had convinced himself that he needed more information before making any decisions. The request was so far outside normal procedures that he wondered if it might be some kind of elaborate test of his integrity, designed to identify officers who might be susceptible to corruption or political manipulation. The next day brought a second phone call from Robert Thornton. This time, requesting an immediate meeting at a discreet location away from military facilities. Andrew agreed, partly from curiosity and partly from a growing sense that understanding Thornton's true intentions was essential for protecting himself and his regiment from whatever scheme was unfolding. They met at a quiet cafe in Kensington, far from the government buildings and military installations where their conversation might be overheard or observed. Thornton was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with a polished appearance and confident manner of someone accustomed to wielding power behind the scenes. His expensive suit and understated accessories suggested wealth and influence, but there was something cold in his eyes that made Andrew immediately wary. "Thank you for coming," Colonel Thornton began once they had settled at a corner table away from other customers. "I trust you've had time to consider the information I shared with you yesterday." Andrew chose his words carefully. "I've reviewed the document, but I have serious questions about what exactly is being requested of me and under whose authority." Thornton smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Let me be more direct, Colonel. The upcoming protest represents an opportunity to demonstrate the need for stronger security measures that certain elements within the government have been advocating. Sometimes democracy needs to be protected from itself, and that requires people in positions of trust to take difficult actions." The explanation confirmed Andrew's worst fears about the nature of Thornton's request. He was being asked to participate in manufacturing a crisis that would justify authoritarian responses to legitimate political dissent. The cynicism of the approach was breathtaking, treating British citizens as pawns in a political game designed to expand government power. What specifically are you asking me to do? Andrew asked, though he dreaded the answer. Thornton leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the privacy of their location. Your ceremonial duties occasionally bring you into contact with security arrangements for public events. We need someone to ensure that a weapon is placed where it can be discovered at the right moment during the protest. The discovery of a firearm among the protesters will justify immediate police action and demonstrate the violent intentions of these so-called peaceful demonstrators. Andrew felt sick as the full scope of the plan became clear. Thornton wanted him to plant a gun among peaceful protesters so that its discovery could be used to justify violent suppression of their demonstration. The scheme was not only morally reprehensible, but also clearly illegal, involving fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to incite violence. I cannot and will not participate in such a scheme, Andrew said firmly. What you're describing is a crime, and it violates every principle I've sworn to uphold as an officer in Her Majesty's service. Thornton's pleasant demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold calculation that revealed his true nature. I'm disappointed in your response, Colonel. I'd hoped that someone of your experience would understand the larger picture. Sometimes protecting democracy requires actions that appear undemocratic to those who don't understand the complexities involved. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in political manipulation and subtle threats. Thornton never explicitly threatened Andrew's career or safety, but he made it clear that refusing to cooperate could have serious consequences. He spoke about budget reviews affecting military units, the competitive nature of promotion boards, and the importance of demonstrating flexibility in an era of changing security challenges. Your regiment has enjoyed considerable prestige and resources, Thornton observed casually. It would be unfortunate if questions were raised about its continued relevance in modern security arrangements. Traditional ceremonial units sometimes struggle to justify their existence when resources are limited. Andrew understood the implied threat perfectly. Cooperation would be rewarded with continued support for his regiment, while refusal could result in budget cuts, reduced responsibilities, and potentially the dissolution of units that had served the Crown for centuries. The threat was particularly effective because it endangered not just Andrew's own career, but the livelihoods and traditions valued by hundreds of soldiers under his command. I need time to consider your proposal, Andrew said finally, knowing that he needed to escape the meeting before committing himself to anything. Thornton nodded approvingly. Of course, Colonel. This is a significant decision that deserves careful consideration. However, time is limited. The protest is scheduled for next Tuesday, and preparations need to be made well in advance. I'll expect your answer by Friday. As Andrew walked away from the meeting, he felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Refusing to participate in Thornton's scheme was the only ethical option. But the potential consequences for his regiment were serious and immediate. Hundreds of soldiers who had devoted their careers to serving the Crown could suffer because of his moral stance. The next few days were torture as Andrew wrestled with his decision. He researched Robert Thornton's background, using his security clearances, and discovered that the man was indeed connected to influential political circles. Though his exact role and authority remained unclear, Thornton appeared to operate in the shadows between official government positions and private political interests, making it difficult to determine whether his requests had legitimate backing. Andrew also spent considerable time thinking about the protesters who would be affected by Thornton's scheme. They were British citizens exercising their constitutional rights to peaceful assembly and free speech. Using his position to facilitate violence against them would be a fundamental betrayal of the democratic principles the monarchy was supposed to represent. The moral clarity of the situation was undeniable, but the practical consequences of refusing to cooperate remained daunting. Andrew found himself considering whether there might be some middle ground, some way to appear cooperative while actually undermining Thornton's plans. However, every scenario he imagined seemed to involve unacceptable risks to innocent people or his own integrity. By Thursday evening, Andrew had made his decision, though he dreaded the conversation that would confirm it. He would refuse to participate in Thornton's scheme, regardless of the consequences for his career or regiment. The principles he had sworn to uphold were more important than any personal or professional considerations. He could not live with himself if he allowed peaceful citizens to be harmed by his actions. However, Andrew also realized that simply refusing might not be enough to prevent the scheme from proceeding. Thornton clearly had resources and connections that could allow him to find other ways to achieve his goals. Andrew began to consider whether he had an obligation to actively oppose the plan, possibly by warning the protesters or alerting authorities about what was being planned. Friday morning arrived with Andrew's decision firmly made. Though his stomach churned at the thought of the confrontation ahead, he had spent the previous evening reviewing his service record, his savings account, and his options for civilian employment, preparing for the possibility that his refusal to cooperate might end his military career. The prospect was devastating, but not as devastating as the thought of betraying everything he believed in before calling Thornton. Andrew decided to take one additional step that might help him understand exactly what he was dealing with. Using his security clearances and contacts within the intelligence community, he made discreet inquiries about Robert Thornton's background and current activities. What he discovered was both reassuring and alarming. Thornton was indeed connected to government circles, but his role was more complex than Andrew had initially understood. He worked as a consultant and facilitator for various political interests, operating in the gray areas between official policy and private agenda. Several of Andrew's contacts warned him that Thornton was known for pushing ethical boundaries and had been involved in previous schemes that had caused problems for military and civilian officials. Most importantly, Andrew learned that Thornton was not acting with official government authorization. His scheme appeared to be a private initiative, designed to advance the interests of specific political factions rather than legitimate state policy. This knowledge strengthened Andrew's resolve to refuse cooperation while also making him realize that exposing the plot might be necessary to protect both the protesters and other officials who might be approached with similar requests. Armed with this information, Andrew made the phone call he had been dreading. Thornton answered immediately as if he had been waiting for Andrew's response. "Colonel Mitchell," Thornton said warmly, "I hope you've had time to consider our discussion and the opportunities it represents." "I have considered it very carefully," Andrew replied, his voice steady despite his inner tension. "I cannot participate in what you've proposed. It violates my oath as an officer and my obligations as a British citizen." The silence that followed was long enough for Andrew to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Thornton finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "That's a very disappointing decision, Colonel. I had hoped that someone of your experience would understand the larger context of what we're trying to accomplish. Your refusal to cooperate will be noted by people who determine the future of military units like yours." Andrew had expected threats, but hearing them stated so baldly was still jarring. "Are you threatening my regiment because I won't participate?" In a criminal conspiracy, Thornton's laugh was cold and humorless. "I'm simply observing that military units that fail to demonstrate their relevance to modern security challenges often find themselves subject to budget reviews and organizational changes. These are natural consequences of changing priorities, not threats." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Thornton alternating between veiled threats and attempts to convince Andrew that his moral concerns were naive and impractical. Andrew remained firm in his refusal, but Thornton's parting words were ominous. "This conversation isn't over, Colonel. There are other ways to achieve necessary objectives, and your obstinate attitude will be remembered when decisions are made about military careers and regimental futures." After ending the call, Andrew sat in his office contemplating his next move. Simply refusing to participate might not be enough to prevent Thornton's scheme from proceeding through other channels. Andrew realized he might have a moral obligation to actively oppose the plot, but doing so would require him to take significant risks and potentially violate protocols about involving military personnel in civilian political matters. Andrew's contemplation was interrupted by Captain Reynolds, who knocked on his office door with obvious urgency. "I've received some unusual inquiries about your background and recent activities," she reported, her expression concerned. "Someone claiming to be from the Cabinet Office has been asking questions about your family, your financial situation, and any possible vulnerabilities that might affect your loyalty or judgment. The news confirmed Andrew's suspicions that Thornton was already taking steps to pressure or discredit him. The timing of the background investigation, coming immediately after his refusal to cooperate, was clearly intended as intimidation. Andrew realized that his problems were likely to escalate rapidly unless he took proactive steps to protect himself and expose Thornton's activities. "Sarah, I need you to document everything about these inquiries," Andrew instructed. "Get names, dates, specific questions asked, and any credentials or authorization claimed by the people making the inquiries. This may become important evidence." That afternoon, Andrew made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the situation. He contacted Colonel James Hartwell, a trusted friend who worked in military intelligence and had experience dealing with political manipulation attempts against military personnel. Andrew requested an urgent private meeting to discuss a matter that could affect national security and military integrity. They met that evening at Hartwell's Club in Central London, a discreet venue where their conversation wouldn't attract attention. Andrew explained the entire situation, from the initial envelope through his refusal to cooperate with Thornton's scheme. Hartwell listened intently, asking pointed questions about Thornton's specific requests and the evidence Andrew had gathered. About his background, "This is exactly the kind of political manipulation we've been warned to watch for," Hartwell said grimly. "There are factions within government and private sector that would love to compromise military officers for their own purposes. The fact that Thornton approached you suggests he's done this before and has had some success." Hartwell explained that Andrew's situation was not unique. Several military officers had been approached in recent months with requests to participate in various schemes involving manufactured security incidents, false flag operations, and political manipulation. Most had refused, but the pattern suggested a coordinated effort to compromise military integrity for political gain. "You need to report this officially," Hartwell advised. "Not just to protect yourself, but to prevent Thornton from succeeding with someone else who might be more vulnerable to pressure or temptation." Andrew had been moving toward this conclusion himself, but hearing it from someone with Hartwell's experience confirmed his instincts. The next morning, he would file a formal report with military intelligence about Thornton's approach and the scheme involving the planned protest. He would also contact civilian authorities to warn them about the potential for manufactured incidents during the upcoming demonstration. The decision to go public with his concerns would inevitably trigger a major investigation and probably end any chance of resolving the situation quietly. Andrew's name would be associated with the scandal, potentially affecting his career regardless of his moral stance. However, the alternative, allowing Thornton's scheme to proceed unchallenged, was unacceptable. As Andrew drove home through the London evening traffic, he reflected on how quickly his life had been transformed by a single envelope and phone call. The comfortable world of military routine and clear moral guidelines had been replaced by complex ethical dilemmas and potentially career-ending choices. Yet despite the uncertainty and risk, Andrew felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in days. He was finally taking action consistent with his principles. Regardless of the personal cost, the protest was scheduled for Tuesday, giving Andrew only a few days to ensure that appropriate authorities were warned about potential false flag operations. Time was running out, but Andrew was determined that Thornton's scheme would not succeed, whatever the consequences for his own future. Saturday morning found Andrew in the offices of MI5, sitting across from Deputy Director Patricia Summers in a secure conference room designed for the most sensitive government discussions. Andrew had spent Friday evening preparing a comprehensive report of his interactions with Thornton, complete with copies of the documents he had received and detailed notes from their conversations. Director Summers was a woman in her early 50s with the sharp, analytical demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with complex security threats. She had listened to Andrew's account without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification about specific details. Her expression grew increasingly grave as the full scope of Thornton's scheme became clear. "Lieutenant Colonel, what you've described represents a serious threat to both national security and democratic institutions," Summers said finally. The fact that someone with Thornton's connections is attempting to manufacture security incidents for political purposes is deeply concerning. Summers explained that Andrew's report fit into a broader pattern of activity that MI5 had been monitoring. For several months, various individuals with connections to extremist political factions had been attempting to recruit government employees, military personnel, and private security contractors to participate in schemes designed to justify authoritarian responses to civil dissent. We've been aware of these recruitment efforts, but your case provides the first detailed account of their specific methods and objectives, Summers continued. Your decision to come forward may have prevented a significant incident that could have had lasting consequences for civil liberties and democratic governance. The intelligence director outlined the next steps in what would become a complex investigation involving multiple agencies and potentially international cooperation. Thornton's connections extended beyond British politics to include relationships with similar movements in other countries, suggesting a coordinated effort to undermine democratic institutions across Western nations. Andrew learned that his report had triggered immediate action to protect the upcoming protest from potential false flag operations. Additional security measures were being implemented, with particular attention to preventing the placement of weapons or other incriminating evidence among legitimate protesters. The protest organizers were being briefed on potential threats. Though the specific details of Thornton's scheme remained classified, "We need your continued cooperation in this investigation," Summers said. "It's likely that Thornton will make additional contact attempts either to pressure you into compliance or to determine what you might have told authorities. We'd like you to maintain the appearance of considering his proposals while we gather evidence about his network and methods." Request to act as an unofficial intelligence asset was both flattering and terrifying. Andrew understood the importance of gathering evidence against Thornton's organization, but the role would require him to continue engaging with people who had demonstrated their willingness to use threats and intimidation against those who opposed them, and Andrew agreed to cooperate with the investigation, though he insisted on clear guidelines about what he could and couldn't do without compromising his military oath or personal safety. Summers assured him that he would receive full support from both MI5 and military intelligence, including protection for his family if Thornton's organization escalated their pressure tactics. The weekend passed in a blur of briefings, security preparations, and anxious waiting. Andrew tried to maintain his normal routine, but the knowledge that he was now part of an active intelligence operation against domestic extremists made every phone call and email feel potentially significant. He found himself analyzing the behavior of colleagues and subordinates, wondering if any of them might have been approached by Thornton's organization. Monday brought the call. Andrew had been both expecting and dreading. Thornton's voice was controlled, but obviously angry when he contacted Andrew's direct line at Wellington Barracks. "Colonel Mitchell, I understand you've been having conversations with people outside our circle of trust," A. Thornton said without preamble. "That's a very unwise decision that could have serious consequences for your career and your regiment." Andrew had been coached by MI5 on how to respond to such contact. His role was to appear concerned about the investigation while trying to gather information about Thornton's plans and associates. "I don't know what you're referring to," Andrew replied, trying to sound convincingly worried. "I've been thinking about our conversation, but I haven't discussed it with anyone." Thornton's laugh was cold and skeptical. "Colonel, we have sources throughout the government and military establishment. Your meeting with MI5 yesterday was noted and reported. Your cooperation with their investigation represents a serious betrayal of trust that cannot be overlooked." The revelation that Thornton had sources within the intelligence community was both alarming and valuable. Andrew made mental notes of the specific references that might help investigators identify security breaches within government agencies. "Was called in for questioning because of my security clearances," Andrew said, sticking to the story he had rehearsed. "They didn't tell me what it was about, just asked general questions about my contacts and activities." Thornton seemed to accept this explanation, though his tone remained threatening. "Colonel, the operation we discussed is proceeding tomorrow with or without your cooperation. However, your recent activities have created complications that require additional measures. It would be in your best interests to ensure that you're not in a position to cause further problems. The conversation ended with Thornton making vague but unmistakable threats about Andrew's safety and career. More significantly, it confirmed that the false flag operation against the protesters was still planned for the following day, despite Andrew's refusal to participate in the ongoing investigation. Andrew immediately reported the conversation to his MI5 contacts, who were alarmed by Thornton's apparent inside knowledge of the investigation. The security breach suggested that Thornton's organization was more sophisticated and better connected than originally believed.
Ow.
Emergency meetings in real time. Emergency meetings were held throughout Monday afternoon and evening as authorities scrambled to address the security breach and ensure the protection of Tuesday's protest. Additional resources were deployed, including undercover officers who would mingle with the protesters to identify and prevent any attempts to plant evidence or incite violence. Andrew spent Monday night in a safe house provided by MI5, both for his own protection and to ensure he would be available for immediate consultation as events unfolded. The experience of being under protection from his own government was surreal, highlighting how far the situation had escalated from his initial moral concerns about Thornton's proposal. As Tuesday morning dawned, Andrew watched television coverage of the gathering protesters with a mixture of anxiety and determination. These were ordinary British citizens exercising their constitutional rights, unaware that they had been targeted by a sophisticated scheme designed to undermine their democracy. Andrew's decision to resist Thornton's initial approach had set in motion events that might protect these people from violence and manipulation. The protests began peacefully, with several hundred demonstrators gathering in Parliament Square to voice their concerns about government policies. Andrew could see the heavy security presence that had been deployed to protect both the protesters and the integrity of the demonstration. Undercover officers mingled with the crowd while uniformed police maintained a discreet but visible presence. Around the perimeter, for the first few hours, nothing unusual occurred. The protesters chanted slogans, carried signs, and listened to speakers who articulated their concerns about military spending and international involvement. Andrew began to hope that Thornton's scheme had been abandoned, or that the security measures had successfully deterred any attempts at manipulation. Then, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Andrew received an urgent phone call from Director Summers with news that would transform his understanding of the entire situation. "Colonel Mitchell, we've just intercepted communications indicating that Thornton's organization is proceeding with their operation despite our security measures," Director Summers said urgently. "They're not trying to plant evidence among the protesters, as we expected. Instead, they're planning to stage an entirely fabricated attack that they'll blame on the demonstrators." Andrew felt his blood run cold as Summers explained the intercepted intelligence. Thornton's group had recruited several individuals to pose as violent protesters who would attack police officers with weapons, creating dramatic footage that could be used to justify a massive crackdown on the peaceful demonstration. The staged violence would be filmed by collaborators in the media, ensuring maximum public impact. "They've learned from our defensive measures," Summers continued. "Since they couldn't plant evidence among real protesters, they've decided to create fake protesters instead. The public won't be able to distinguish between genuine demonstrators and the actors hired to discredit them." The sophistication of the revised scheme was breathtaking in its cynicism. By staging violence rather than simply planting evidence, Thornton's organization could control every aspect of the incident, ensuring that the footage would be dramatic enough to shift public opinion against peaceful protest and justify authoritarian responses to civil dissent. Andrew realized that his moral stance against Thornton's original proposal had inadvertently forced the conspirators to develop an even more elaborate deception. He felt partially responsible for the escalation, even though he knew that refusing to participate had been the only ethical choice available to him. "What can be done to stop it?" Andrew asked, though he dreaded the answer. Summers explained that the security services were working frantically to identify the staged attackers before they could carry out their performance. However, The individuals involved had been carefully selected and trained to blend in with legitimate protesters, till the moment they revealed weapons and began their assault on police officers. "We need your help, Colonel," Summers said. "Your military experience and knowledge of Thornton's organization might be crucial in identifying the staged attackers before they can implement their plan." Andrew was transported immediately to a command center overlooking Parliament Square, where multiple screens displayed live footage from security cameras and undercover officers throughout the protest area. Intelligence analysts were studying faces in the crowd, looking for individuals who didn't fit the profile of genuine protesters or who showed signs of military or security training. The atmosphere in the command center was tense, as dozens of personnel worked to prevent what could become a watershed moment in British politics. The success of Thornton's scheme could provide justification for massive restrictions on civil liberties and the transformation of Britain into a more authoritarian state. Andrew studied the video feeds carefully, looking for behavioral patterns that might indicate professional training or preparation for violence. His military experience helped him identify several individuals whose posture and movement suggested combat training, distinguishing between genuine security concerns and ordinary protesters who happened to have military backgrounds was challenging. At 3:15 p.m., Andrew spotted something that made his pulse quicken. In one camera feed, he noticed a group of 4 men who were positioned strategically around the protest area, but weren't participating in the chanting or sign-carrying that characterized the genuine demonstrators. Their positioning would allow them to create a coordinated attack from multiple directions, while ensuring maximum visibility for any cameras recording the incident. "Those 4 men," Andrew said, pointing to the screen, "are not protesting, they're staging for an assault. Look at their positions and how they keep checking their watches. They're waiting for a signal to begin simultaneous attacks." That intelligence analysts quickly identified the individuals Andrew had spotted and began tracking their movements through multiple camera angles. Additional surveillance revealed that each man was carrying concealed weapons and communication devices that would allow them to coordinate their staged assault. As the afternoon progressed, more suspicious individuals were identified through similar analysis. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its scope. Thornton's organization had infiltrated the protest with at least a dozen trained operatives prepared to stage spectacular violence that would be blamed on peaceful demonstrators. At 4 p.m., the decision was made to intervene before the staged assault could begin. Plainclothes officers moved through the crowd to quietly arrest the suspected operatives, while uniformed police prepared to manage any chaos that might result from the sudden intervention. Andrew watched from the command center as the carefully planned arrests unfolded. One by one, the suspected operatives were approached by undercover officers and quietly removed from the protest area. The genuine protesters remained largely unaware of the drama unfolding around them, continuing their peaceful demonstration while a sophisticated attack against their democratic rights was being dismantled. However, not all of the operatives were captured in the initial sweep. 2 individuals managed to evade arrest and began implementing their assigned roles in the staged attack. At 4:23 p.m., they produced weapons and began shouting inflammatory slogans while moving aggressively toward police lines, creating exactly the kind of dramatic footage Thornton's organization needed to justify their narrative about violent protesters. The response from legitimate security forces was immediate but carefully calibrated. Rather than allowing the staged attackers to provoke the massive police response they were seeking, specially briefed officers moved to contain the incident, while clearly identifying the attackers as isolated individuals rather than representatives of the broader protest movement. The staged attack was over within minutes, but its failure to achieve the desired political impact was immediately obvious. Instead of dramatic footage of violent protesters overwhelming police defenses, the media captured images of isolated attackers being subdued while hundreds of genuine protesters continued their peaceful demonstration. Thornton's scheme had failed, but the broader implications of what had been attempted were staggering. Andrew realized that he had witnessed an effort to fundamentally alter British democracy through manufactured crisis and manipulated public opinion. The scope of the conspiracy suggested resources and organization that went far beyond what any single individual could assemble. Director Summers briefed Andrew on the immediate aftermath of the failed operation. The arrested operatives were being interrogated to determine the full extent of Thornton's network and identify other potential threats to democratic institutions. Several were already providing information about similar schemes being planned in other countries, confirming that the threat was international in scope. Your decision to resist Thornton's initial approach and report his activities may have prevented a fundamental transformation of British society, Summers told Andrew. The footage they were planning to create could have justified massive restrictions on civil liberties and the suppression of legitimate political dissent. As evening fell over London, Andrew found himself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past week. His simple, moral decision to refuse participation in an unethical scheme that exposed a sophisticated conspiracy against democratic institutions and potentially prevented a major crisis in British governance. Yet, Andrew also realized that the battle against such threats to democracy was far from over. Thornton's organization represented just one element of a larger movement that sought to undermine democratic institutions through deception and manufactured crisis. The failure of this particular scheme would likely lead to the development of new and more sophisticated approaches. The personal cost of Andrew's moral stance was also becoming clear. While he had prevented a serious threat to British democracy, his involvement in the investigation had inevitably made him a target for Thornton's organization and similar groups. His military career would need to be carefully managed to ensure his continued effectiveness while protecting him from retaliation. Director Summers addressed these concerns directly. Colonel, your actions over the past week have demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and moral courage that democratic institutions depend upon. However, we're also aware that your safety and career may be affected by your decision to oppose these conspirators. Arrangements were being made to provide Andrew with ongoing security support and to ensure that his military career wouldn't suffer because of his role in exposing the conspiracy. The intelligence services were also working to identify and neutralize other members of Thornton's network who might seek revenge against those who had thwarted their schemes as Andrew prepared to return to his duties at Wellington Barracks. He felt a profound sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. The decision to maintain his integrity in the face of pressure and threats had protected innocent people and democratic institutions, but it had also revealed the ongoing nature of threats to the society he had sworn to defend. The evening news coverage of the day's events focused on the successful peaceful protest and the arrest of several individuals who had attempted to incite violence. The broader conspiracy remained classified, but Andrew knew that the real story was far more significant than what the public would ever learn. Standing in his office late that Tuesday night, looking out at the lights of London, Andrew reflected on the lesson he had learned about the nature of moral courage. It wasn't just about making the right choice in a single moment of crisis, but about accepting the ongoing responsibility that came with that choice. The hidden gun that Thornton had wanted him to plant would have been a weapon against democracy, itself used to justify the suppression of legitimate political expression. By refusing to participate in that scheme, Andrew had helped preserve the freedoms that made Britain worth defending. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but Andrew faced them with the confidence that comes from knowing he had chosen integrity over expediency when the stakes were highest. The moral test he had faced was over, but the commitment to democratic values it had revealed would guide him for the rest of his career. 6 months after the failed conspiracy at Parliament Square, Andrew found himself in a very different world than the one he had known before, receiving that fateful envelope. The investigation into Thornton's network had expanded into a major international operation, uncovering similar schemes in 12 different countries and leading to dozens of arrests across Europe and North America. Andrew had been promoted to full colonel and transferred to a new position within military intelligence, where his experience with political manipulation attempts was considered invaluable for protecting other service members from similar recruitment efforts. The promotion was both a recognition of his integrity and a practical acknowledgement that his previous role had been compromised by his involvement in the investigation. The new position brought Andrew into regular contact with intelligence services from allied nations, all of whom were grappling with similar threats to their democratic institutions. He had become something of an expert on the psychology and methods used by groups seeking to recruit government and military personnel for political manipulation schemes. During a briefing at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Andrew met with Colonel Sarah Chen from Canadian Military Intelligence, who had dealt with a similar conspiracy attempt in Toronto just 2 months earlier. Her experience echoed Andrew's own, involving pressure to participate in manufacturing security incidents that could justify authoritarian responses to civil dissent. The pattern is remarkably consistent across different countries, Chen observed during their private conversation. They always approach people with strong reputations for integrity, believing that corruption of respected individuals will provide more credibility for their schemes. Andrew had come to understand this strategy through his ongoing work with the investigation. Thornton's organization and similar groups specifically targeted individuals whose moral standing would lend legitimacy to their activities. The corruption of respected military officers, judges, and civil servants was seen as more valuable than recruiting obviously compromised individuals. The psychological pressure techniques were also remarkably similar across different operations. The initial approach always emphasized patriotic duty and the protection of democratic values, gradually revealing the true nature of the scheme only after the target was emotionally invested in the relationship. Threats and intimidation were reserved for those who refused to cooperate, escalating in severity based on the target's perceived vulnerability. Andrew's own experience had become a case study, used in training programs for military and civilian personnel who might be targeted by similar schemes. His decision-making process, from initial suspicion through final exposure of the conspiracy, provided a template for recognizing and resisting political manipulation attempts. The training programs were desperately needed. Regularly, just the previous month, a senior civil servant in the Foreign Office had been approached with a scheme involving the manipulation of trade negotiations to benefit specific political factions. The official had reported the approach immediately. Having been briefed on Andrew's case and similar incidents, Robert Thornton himself remained in custody, though his trial had been delayed multiple times as prosecutors worked to understand the full scope of his activities and identify all his co-conspirators. The evidence gathered from his computers and communications had revealed a sophisticated network spanning multiple continents, connections to extremist political movements, foreign intelligence services, and organized criminal organizations. During one of Andrew's visits to provide testimony for the ongoing investigation, he learned that Thornton had specifically targeted him because of his reputation for integrity and his position within the Royal Guards. The conspirators had believed that corrupting someone so close to the monarchy would provide maximum symbolic impact for their anti-democratic message. He spent months studying your background, your family situation, your financial status, and your career ambitions, the prosecutor explained during Andrew's testimony preparation. The approach was carefully designed to exploit what they perceived as your most likely vulnerabilities. The revelation that Andrew had been under surveillance for months before the initial contact was disturbing, but also educational. It highlighted the sophisticated intelligence gathering capabilities of groups seeking to undermine democratic institutions and the importance of being aware of potential manipulation attempts. Andrew's family had also been affected by the events, though they had been protected from the worst consequences through careful security arrangements. His wife Margaret had initially struggled to understand why Andrew's simple moral decision had led to such dramatic upheaval in their lives, but she had come to take pride in his role in protecting democratic institutions. Their 2 teenage children had been briefed on basic security precautions without being told the full details of the threats their family faced. The experience had been educational for them as well, providing real-world lessons about the importance of integrity and the costs sometimes associated with doing the right thing. The broader impact of the investigation had extended throughout British government and military institutions. New protocols were implemented for reporting suspicious contact attempts. Enhanced security clearance reviews were instituted for positions with access to sensitive information, and regular training programs were established to help personnel recognize manipulation attempts. Andrew often reflected on how different life might have been if he had made different choices during that initial week. Cooperation with Thornton's scheme would have provided short-term benefits for his career and regiment while contributing to the erosion of democratic values he had sworn to protect. The immediate rewards would have been substantial, but the long-term consequences would have been devastating. The choice to maintain his integrity had been personally costly in some ways, disrupting his family's life and forever changing his career trajectory. However, it had also provided him with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that no promotion or financial benefit could match. He had helped preserve the democratic institutions that made his country worth defending. Andrew's story had also inspired others within the military and civil service to take similar stands when faced with pressure to compromise their integrity. Several officers had contacted him directly to seek advice about suspicious approaches they had received, and the training programs based on his experience had helped dozens of others recognize and resist manipulation attempts. As Andrew stood in his new office overlooking the Thames, reading reports about ongoing investigations into similar conspiracies around the world, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the choice he had made. The hidden gun that Thornton had wanted him to plant would have been a weapon aimed at the heart of British democracy. But Andrew's moral courage had helped ensure that weapon was never deployed. The battle to protect democratic institutions from internal threats was ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and the willingness of individuals to choose integrity over personal advantage when faced with moral tests. Andrew had passed his test, but he knew that others would face similar choices in the future. The experience had taught Andrew that moral courage wasn't just about dramatic moments of crisis, but about the daily commitment to uphold principles, even when compromise might seem easier or more profitable. Every person in a position of trust would eventually face choices that revealed their true character, and the cumulative impact of those individual decisions would determine the fate of the institutions they served. Standing guard over democracy required more than ceremonial uniforms and traditional protocols. It demanded the willingness to recognize threats to the values those ceremonies represented and the courage to oppose them regardless of personal cost. Andrew had learned that lesson the hard way, but he was grateful for the opportunity to serve his country in this deeper, more meaningful way. The moral test was over, but the commitment to integrity it had revealed would guide Andrew for the rest of his life, inspiring others to make similar choices when their own moments of testing arrived.